his mother and my grandmother were related, Washmans. But anyway, we're really fortunate to have him. He agreed to come back and talk again. He talked once years ago when he first published the book, The Dick and Willie History of the Danville Western Railroad. And it just so happens we have a few copies left on hand if anybody wants to purchase one, and somebody already has. Bear in mind, we only published 100 copies. It's a paperback edition, soft cover, whatever you want to call it, versus a hardback, and 35 versus 60 or more with the original copy. We have a time getting it republished. We had sold out and finally got it done just this year. And it took a
thanks to the Historical Society.
Well, he's also, just like Beverly, anything that's sold here, he's donating the profits from it to the museum, so we really appreciate that. And I'll let him get started, and thanks again to everybody for coming, and please, after the program, if you want to buy a book, get him to sign it, and then stop by here and grab you a snack or something before you go. There's a lot of food there, and we don't want to haul it all home. Thanks.
All right, I'm shooting on time. John's TV, not mine. John, I'm hooked up. I said, may need to go over here. All right, good deal.
Did you mail that? That's the enter, it's not showing.
Welcome. Thank you for having me, John. John and I talked a few weeks ago, and he asked me would I do this, and I said yes, but I said we have the full history in the book, and we want to encourage people to buy the book. So about 5 or 6 years ago, I started working on a program of showing how the arrival of the railroad into Stuart kind of helped develop and take place during the railroad years, especially. And I said, do you mind if I do that program? He said, no, I guess not, whatever. So I said I would do that, and then he put the article out in the paper, and I read that, and I said, wow, let's put a lot of emphasis on the railroad. And I put in the new program, I put more emphasis on the development of Taylorsville and Stuart as opposed to the railroad. I just intermingled it. So 2 nights ago, I changed it, and I split it up and did the first half is more a condensed version of history of the D&W, and then move on over to the development of Stuart. So I look like I've gotten lost somewhere. I probably am lost and can't remember why I did what I did, but anyway, we'll got a lot of slides to do, so I'll try not to belabor this thing. As far as the railroad is concerned, I told John that I named a new program Milepost 75. Stuart was actually located at 74.9. That's where the milepost that was in the yard next to where the turntable was. So I named 75. That's where Milepost 75 would actually been right beyond George's Mill if it was still there. And so like I said, that's where we'll go today. We'll talk about the railroad and then move over to a little bit of the development of town. In the early days, in the 1870s, this is a map of somewhat of Southwest Virginia, and in red there you see running from Richmond to Danville was the Richmond and Danville Railroad, which later became the Southern Railway, and then the yellow one going across the eastern part of east to west is the Atlantic, Mississippi, and Ohio, and that later became Norfolk and Western. Those were the 2 main roads, and that was the closest to our area. Of course, here is Taylorsville here, and this whole area in here had no way to get their products in and out of the rural counties. So they wanted a railroad, tried before the Civil War, then the war came and they had to put it off for a while. So in 1873, this is an article from the Richmond Whig, and here it talks about a group of citizens from Patrick County, Henry County, Pennsylvania County, and some of the western counties that all sent a delegation to Richmond, and they chartered a new railroad to be a narrow gauge railroad, and I'll explain the difference what a narrow gauge is in a few minutes. But the name of the new railroad was to be the Danville and New River Railroad, and it basically was to be a connector line between those two major roads. It would start at Danville, run across the mountain, and connect somewhere around Christiansburg was the plans on the new railroad. So after a lengthy recession in the latter part of the 70s, they finally bought the first locomotive in 1880 and started the construction. This is number one, and you notice the size of it, how small it is compared to those guys standing there. Narrow gauge railroads were, you can think of them more like a 3/4 size train. They started construction in 80. They got us somewhere around Cascade, which is right around the Pennsylvania Henry County line by December of 81. So operations actually started at the end of 1881. At the same time, there was another railroad that was chartered to run from Danville and go southwest toward Mocksville and cross into it and go through Leedsville and Madison, and that was the intent of it. So it ran out of money very quickly, and it got as far as Leedsville. If anybody that doesn't know, that's Eden today. And so they leased it out, and the Danville and New River also ran that railroad as well. So they had that leg that branched off to the Leedsville, Draper, and Sprague area, right from almost from the very beginning. This is the early Martinsville Depot. This is they arrived in Martinsville 1883 and ran out of money. It cost them a lot more money to get to Martinsville than what they anticipated. So people in Patrick still was yearning for a railroad. So they passed, the people in Patrick passed a bond referendum in 1883 and pledged $150,000. So Danville and New River took that and started heading toward Patrick County. They, the next slide is, because of that pledge, this was locomotive number 3, and they actually named it Patrick County. Instead of numbering those early locomotives, they named them. First one was Henry County. Second one was City of Danville, and this was number 3. It was named Patrick County. So the first train arrived in Taylorsville on August the 29th, 1884. This is a timetable from the mid-1880s. I know you can't read that from where you're at, but it shows the different locations. But bottom line, there's 15 locations. So the map that I drew here will give you an idea of what the line looked like with the 15 stops, including, not including the one here to Lisa. This is an early advertisement, and this is a picture of the etchogram of the depot at Danville. It also was a passenger station, and this ad was from the mid-1880s. And just to read a couple of lines here to give you a flavor. The line runs through Henry County, the greatest tobacco region in the world. Patrick County, noted for its fine fruit. Patrick Mineral Springs and near Patrick Springs Depot in the Mount Airy White Sulphur Springs, about 22 miles from Stuart Depot, from which packs run daily. So every day they would run a little hack over to Surrey County to that hotel there. This is a passenger car also from that era. This is was bought in 1886. They had a lot of really nice equipment, nice passenger cars, nice locomotives. And bottom line, it was too nice. They ran out of money again. They spent so much money building a nice railroad, and even though the revenues were filed bankruptcy in the fall of 1886 and ran for the next 4 years. They operated under receivership. You can see in this ad here from the latter part of the 80s down to the bottom where J.C. Renshaw was the receiver, so he operated while it was in a court battle. 1890, they put a notice out that they were going to sell the railroad. It was bought at auction. And, the guy who bought it, his name is on this first stock certificate, J. Wilcox Brown here. He actually bought it for the Richmond and Danville Railroad. It was kind of under the table deal. And he changed the name in early 1891 to the Danville and Western Railroad Company. At that time, since there was no more money, obviously that it wasn't going across the mountain, wasn't going to New River. So Stuart was going to be the terminus, and so that changed. So the name became Danville and Western at that time. Like I said, he bought it, so he immediately turned it over to the Richmond and Danville in the early 1890s. They allowed it to continue to operate as the Danville and Western. It was a subsidiary of Richmond and Danville. Richmond and Danville, a couple of years later, 1893, joined a couple of other railroads, and they all formed the Southern Railway system. And so the Danville and Western fell under the ownership of Southern Railway. They also allowed them to continue to operate as a subsidiary under that name. And that's the way it stayed for many years to come. At the end of the 1890s, I mentioned earlier that the Danville New River was a narrow gauge. So narrow gauge is referencing the distance between the rails here. So for this one on the right is a narrow gauge boxcar. It's 3 feet between the rails here. This is a standard boxcar, and it's 4 feet 8.5 inches. So it was much cheaper back in the day. They built the railway to build a narrow gauge, but later on it became much more efficient to transfer over goods, especially when cotton mills started springing up in the Leaksville area, and a lot of cotton was coming in, and it would come in on the standard gauge boxcars. They'd have to manually unload it, load it over to a narrow gauge, and truck it up to Leaksville. So it just made good sense to go ahead and switch over at that time. So they did that by using a third rail. So it went from 1899 until 1903. It took them to do the entire line, and they did it with a third rail. The narrow gauge would use these 2 rails, and the standard gauge, as they started doing standard gauge, would use the outer rails. So this is probably a Southern Railway locomotive that they borrowed and used during the transition time. That's at the Martinsville Depot. 1903, a big celebration in Stuart. I think that picture is probably from that day. Nobody can say for sure, but I do think there was a photographer in town that day. But there was a big celebration held, and it was a big deal. The governor was here. They had a big barbecue, and it looked like a busy day at the depot. During the early days, during that transition time, like I said, they would use other locomotives. This is another Southern locomotive that they used early on during the transition. This is at the Draper Depot near Leaksville. And also the boxcar there, the passenger car was, they bought about 15 passenger cars from Pennsylvania Railroad. As Pennsylvania Railroad updated their equipment, these cars came out probably the 1880s. So they were very nice cars, but they were just about 20, 25 years old when the Danville and Western bought them. But they used them for the next 30 years. So in 1904, they purchased the first of 5 new locomotives that they owned while they existed. This is number 20. Also in 1904 was number 21. It was purchased to be a freight locomotive. Then 22 and 23 were identical. They both were 1905. So then in 1913, they bought number 24, which was another freight locomotive, and those were the 5 locomotives that were purchased just to be Danville and Western locomotives, not used or whatever. I won't go through all the depots, because there were a lot of them by this time, but just some of the highlights. This was the, I showed you the earlier Martinsville depot. This was the, this is the latter Martinsville depot, 1907, 1908, when that one was built. And they did a lot of renovations on depots during that era, around 1910, on both sides of 1910. So another one, this is Cola. The interesting thing about Cola was had upper tracks and lower tracks. Lower side was Danville and Western, upper track was Norfolk and Western. So you could catch a train to Stuart, go to Cola, go up on the top side, catch one to Roanoke or Winston-Salem or wherever. So it's that right between the two set of tracks. And then also you saw a picture of the early Danville station. This is the depot at Danville, built about 1913. This is Craighead Street here. It's like they're doing some work and there's got some dirt in the middle of the street, but you could walk across the street there, and right across, directly across the street diagonal from the D&W station was the Southern Railway station. So there again, you could catch the Dick and Willie down to Danville and walk across the street and catch it anywhere the Southern Railroad traveled. So it made it very convenient for travelers.
So what the Amtrak station is now?
It is. They lost this tower in a fire back in the teens. They did put it back on, but I think for the most part, I think the station still looks similar to that. Last time I was there. And here again, writing is too small to see, but the purpose of this is show you a timetable from let's say the teens to 1920. There was about 32 locations now, so the number of locations doubled over the years, and a lot of those were little small stations. And as the United States entered World War I, the government took over all major railroads in 1918, and the D&W was no exception. You can see from this flyer here that it is from the United States Railroad Administration. Operated under them for the next 2 years, and then I think early in 1920 they go back to the owners, and but total government control there for a couple of years. In the 1920s, this is the Leaksville station. The back end of it showing the passenger ends up here, and this is the freight in the back. But you see all the busy vehicles there. Passenger service and freight service suffered a little bit, started to decline in the 1920s, mainly because of the automobile, the public highways system came into being, and the states took over the highway systems and made the roads better. And then also you had small trucks that were able to transport goods even there versus the railroad. So the railroad had to start shifting some at that time, putting more focus on freight. They still survived another 10 years with passenger service, but through means like this. There you see a 58% reduction, trying to encourage people to travel by as opposed to cars. And then also they updated their passenger cars around 1930 and bought three newer ones. And this is one of those that a little more modern appearance for that time than what they were operating out of the 1880s. As I said, more emphasis had to be placed on the freight because the passenger service was eventually going to decline and go away. This is a freight train actually going through Kreitz. That one is, and here's another freight train. That one I think is somewhere in the Ashton area. But that is a typical train. That's about 14, 16, 18 cars. That's about the max that those locomotives could pull. Not like the what you see the diesel pulling 200 cars today, it just didn't have that power. So that's a normal freight train there. Regardless of how much efforts they put into everything, the freight in, trying to keep the western portion had always, the western portion line from Philadelphia to Stuart had never really made any money. Apples were a big deal and chestnuts were a big deal. During the chestnut and apple crop, they could break even, but the rest of the time was pretty much a losing profit. So this is the letter that went out to all of the stations and merchants and business people and customers on the western portion from Philadelphia to Stuart. They announcing that the railroad was going to close on July 31st of 1942. World War II had started 6 months prior to that, and the newly created War Production Board came in and declared that they were going to close that 26-mile portion of the line to use the rails for the war efforts. So this is the last train out of Stuart. It left on, I think it left on July 31st. I think that was a Saturday, and Monday morning they started pulling up the rails and set fire to the turntable and used all the metal for scrap for the war effort. Passenger service survived somewhat through the 40s, but only in 1949 finally discontinued passenger service. This is the last passenger train to leave the Leedsville. This is the Leedsville station here. Now, I only put this one in to let you see what a downwind western train looked like in color. I've only seen three color photos of downwind western locomotives on trains during this era, before diesel, you know. And this is one of them. This is crossing. This is Smith River here, the trestle crossing Smith River. Then this is over the Culver Road. That's the bridge going over top of the highway there. Very nice shot from 1949. That was the end. Summer of '49 was the end of that phase. They dieselized in August of 1949, and they bought two diesels, and number one and number two. Number one went to Martinsville the next morning, and number two went to Leedsville the next morning. This is number two going at Leedsville. They operated for another couple of years like that, and then in 1951, Southern owned 5 different short line railroads. They combined all 5 of those short lines to create a new line called the Carolina and Northwestern Railroad Company, and each one of those 5 took a division name. So the Danville Western became the Martinsville division of that company at that time, and continued to operate for the next 20 years as the Carolina and Northwestern Martinsville division. Finally in the there's another locomotive there with the Carolina Northwestern logo on it, and painted with the Southern scheme of green, gold, and white. Then in the 70s, they just started operating with Southern Railway equipment. This is a Southern locomotive and caboose, again crossing the Smith River trestle there. And then finally, that lasted until about 1984, when Northwestern and Southern Railway combined to create the Norfolk Southern that we still have today. Norfolk and Western already were running trains through Martinsville, and there was not a need to run one from Danville to Martinsville at that point. So they pretty much started taking the tracks up after that merger there. So that's a kind of an overview of the history of the railroad. And like I said, if anybody wants to very detailed, there's a lot of slides in here, and I'll try not to get off on a tangent and get sidetracked, because we'll keep this fairly timely. But this is looking down Main Street from the top early on. There's Carter's Mountain in the background. In the early days, the Shelton family came into this area, and Ralph Shelton, he had a son named Eliphaz Shelton. Eliphaz fought in the Revolutionary War, and in 1784, he was given 580 acres, and that pretty much was everything we know of Stuart VA today included in that. It pretty much ran from the river to the east, to the west side as well. And but Eliphaz, he donated 18 acres at the beginning when Patrick County was formed in 1791. He donated 18 acres to be used for the county administration, buildings, courthouse, whatever, and it's pretty much as we know it today. He, in this ridge here at the bottom of the hill that doesn't exist anymore, because they took it down a few years ago, but if you focus between this tree and this electric pole here, and there's a blow up there, and I have circles, you can see it resembles a house there. There's the back of the ridge, the crest of the ridge there at the back, and then it goes on downtown. And this is the house that Eliphaz Shelton lived in, and there on that ridge. So we owe the location of the town to him. Let's jump to 1845. A report came out in 1845 for Taylorsville. This is what it showed: 40 to 50 dwellings, 2 mercantile stores, 3 taverns, a tailor, a tannery, a salary, a flour mill, and 2 tobacco factories. So now let's jump to the end of the Civil War. These 2 guys from Patrick County, Captain Andrew M. Liebrook and Colonel John E. Penn, both came back home after the war, resumed their law practices that both had started before they went into service and fought. Let's look at Liebrook first. He married Hardin Reynolds' daughter Mary, and R.J. Reynolds' brother, sister, and in 1867, and they, this is in this map of Stuart here, just picture this being the downtown area. There's a river as it flows through it, and Judge Liebrook in 1870 bought pretty much everything all the way over to the turnpike, to 58 today, and on both sides of the river. And that was 150 acres there that he owned. And he built his house on the other side of the river. This is what it looked like early on with the fountain. Most of you remember it looking more like this. It was white for as long as I can remember before they tore it down, but it was located there where the food country complex is today. And then Colonel Penn, born in Patrick County, he married a Hodge lady from Montgomery County. They in 1870, this was their home. This is where the post office is today, and they lived there for 5 years. They sold that in 1875 to John Rangeley, and they moved downtown. And here again, remember, Liebrook's property was here, so Colonel Penn bought adjoining property on both sides of the river, and more or less where the nursing home complex is today. So as the railroad started announcing what they were going to do in coming to Patrick County, and if you remember, I said that they got as far as Spencer in 1873. So in November of 73, they announced that they were going to locate the depot at, their wording was near Williams Mill. Williams Mill was where we know it, Georgia's Mill today, there right there at the bridge. Judge Liebrook, of course, owned all that property surrounding he didn't actually own the mill, but he did own the land that adjoined the mill on both sides. So they were going to locate there on his property, and in December Penn here, he come forth and he objected, and he and some other citizens backing him, they wanted it on his property. He offered the railroad, free access through his property and $500 if they would put it on his property. So the railroad, they hedged on it for a while, and finally in 18, let's see, let me think a second. In July, they scheduled a meeting in the courthouse at Taylorsville, and let anybody speak and see what they want, where any rewards that they wanted to offer. So John Penn came and spoke for his side. Judge Liebrook didn't. He had someone else to come and address the group. But bottom line, it ended up being on Judge Liebrook's property. He had become a judge by that time, was very influential. He also went to state senate. So it ended up being on his property, and said there's both properties together, so we all know. And because of that, that's the reason we have downtown Stuart today. That's the main reason I wanted to point that out. Just as a side note, before they ran out of money, the initial plans were to go around the north side of the county and come into Stuart. They wanted to go to Fairstone area because of the minerals over there. But then when money got low, they changed their mind and had to take the closest route, the cheapest route, and that's why they decided to go the route they did, which was through Stella, through Crike, through Patrick Springs to Stuart. So who knows where they would have gone into Stuart had they stayed with the original plan, but after they changed their minds, they're going to come in downtown somewhere. So when the first train came to Stuart, or Taylorsville, sorry, still Taylorsville at that time, they said people lined this hillside and both sides of the track as the first train rolled in on August the 29th. And this is, I put this here, this is about all you would have seen, but you wouldn't have seen this much, because if they didn't decide until July to put the location to the depot where they did, then obviously the depot would not have been there 2 months later when they came to town. So depot probably wasn't built, but Judge Liebrook had put a store up here, and so that store was in place, I think, and for sure, you can see the top of what was called the box factory in the background here. It was between the depot and the river. So that box factory was purchased, the property for it in 1883, 1 year before. So that would have been there. Williams Mill, that had been over where George's Mill used to be, it had burned in January of '84, so even the mill wasn't there by the time that the railroad got there. But the miller's house was. This house set up above the mill, and that was the first dwelling in the downtown area that we know today. Go uptown, and this is what uptown looked like. Of course, you had the courthouse. This is the early photo of the courthouse before it was renovated in the 1920s, so it didn't have the jail onto it, and that's the way it looked in the early days. Behind it was the jail, and this set about where the old Stuart Tire location across from the bank, where it sat, and also just as an interesting note, that's where elementary school is today. That was the house of Colonel Abram Staples. This house was right behind the courthouse, between the courthouse and jail. It was belonged to W.B. Rucker. And then here, looking at the courthouse, this building here, that's the building that's there today. It was built in 1893, so it wasn't there in the 1880s when the railroad got here. The old jail was there at that location. It was also a brick jail that they had discontinued in the 1850s and built the new jail. And the old one was turned into a store and a tavern, and so it was still there at that time. And then, one building below it was Moyer's storehouse. So this store was there at that time, and then the one below it was Murray Turner's storehouse. And then below it, and below Rock Cove Road, was Murray Turner's house. So it's set down there where Alexander's parking lot, or the school board office, the school board parking lot is today. At the top of the street, this was W.B. Rucker's store, set where Appalachian Title is today. And beside of it is, as we know, the Hooker Building today, but there was a law office. Colonel Penn had a law office there in the 1880s. And of course, we're looking at it from the yard of the Stonewall House, and there it is where the bank is today. It was the old Stonewall House built by Samuel Staples in the late 1700s. And then across the road from there, see here's this Stonewall House. So J.H. Ranger, if you remember, I said this house that had belonged to Colonel Penn, he had sold it to J.H. Ranger. So Ranger lived in the house and also built that store place there at the top of the street. Now this is not a very good picture, but any picture at all from this time period is better than no picture. So, but this is it's probably taken from the cemetery. You see, here's the Stonewall House, here's Ranger's store, and here's Ranger's house. Well, right here on the east side of Main Street, there was 4 or 5 little shops before I changed slides. Also, this is the earlier Stuart Methodist Church before it was rebuilt. Those shops here, here's one. I think this later was Dr. Dickerson's office, but it was built these shops were built in the 1870s and 1880s, and there were dry goods stores. There was a tin shop there. There was a tavern there earlier. There were very small shops there, about 5 of them, right at the top of the eastern part of the street. And then as you go on out, it was Church Street back at that time, what's Blue Ridge Street now. As you go towards the east side of town, this was Stuart Normal School. It would have been there at that time, and across the street from it was Stuart Baptist Church. These houses did not come for another 10 or 15 years, but this is Dr. Byers' house. He was a local dentist, and that house was where Patrick Henry, or Carter Bank is today. So that house is there also. Then if you come on down to what is Forest Avenue today, this house was also there. This belonged to A.J. Bishop. He was a woodworker and had a shop across the road there in the curve on the opposite side of the highway. And then down at the bottom of the hill, even though it was outside of town at that time, this was Ben Campbell's house. He was an attorney in Stuart, and that house is still there today, of course, right beyond the school board office. So this takes us to the fall. In November, the Taylorsville was renamed honor Jeb Stuart. So that's when Stuart came into being. And let's go back downtown now. See what some of the development after the railroad came. This Judge Lodbrooke, like I said, he owned all the property there, so he started selling a little bit of property. He sold a couple of lots in 1886. He put a stipulation on those lots that you had to build a building of at least $500 value. So this was one of those first 2 that was bought. This was a Riverside Hotel, and it was bought by J.W. Hooker and George Nolan, 2 businessmen in town. The other one I don't have a picture of, but the other one was over on the Depot Square, the upper end of where Tony's Pizza is today, and it was bought by Perkins, Joseph Perkins, and he built a tavern there. And obviously it was a $500 tavern, I guess, but it didn't last but it lasted about 8 to 10 years, and then in the early 90s, it was replaced with this Ranger and McIntosh building. So that building sat there on the upper end of Depot Square. And the famous picture of Stuart that we saw earlier, picture, you will see that awning right there in the photograph, the picture. Behind that building up on the hill, you will remember, most everyone remembers this as being Jeff Carter, Curtis Carter's dad's house, but it was actually built in 1887 by another guy. He was into minerals, and he was here, and I think it was named a mineral, I can't think of it anyway. That was built in 1887, and then one right below it, there's the house I just looked at, and then here's this one that's between it and the Mills house. Now, in 1893, Dr. R.S. Martin built a mother's home sanatorium close to the hospital, and he purchased, at that time, John Penn, if you remember, I said he owned about 250 acres there around the nursing home. So John Penn moved to Roanoke. He sold to Dr. Martin that 250 acres, and he put the sanatorium there where the Blue Ridge Therapy is today. And Clark Brothers, 1898, they built this building first, I think, and then a year or two later came back with this one, is my understanding. And then over on the opposite side of Depot Square, most of you remember this one as George's Mill. It actually was built by Will Clark. He built it right around 1900 and sold it to George in, I think, 1903, 1904. Let's go back uptown now. This was, remember I said Dr. Martin built the mother's home downtown. Well, this is Dr. Martin and a good friend of his, Rufus Connor. He was a pharmacist. Dr. Martin actually bought a house a few years before, about in the late 1880s, before he built the sanatorium downtown. So he had a house, and he also, on the east side, where those little small shops was, there was an older house in the back of one of those lots, and he bought that as well as the store place that went with it, and then also went across the street and bought Moya's store place here, and he used that as his place of business, I guess a doctor's office and a drugstore. I know it was a drugstore at one time, and he had his friend Rufus Connor as a pharmacist there. And then in 1891, he between Moya's store, between his store there and what I said was the old jail, there was like an empty lot. So he built this drugstore in 1891, and that later became Connor's drugstore. But Dr. Martin owned it all the time until he died. And also, at this time, there were no banks in Stuart, and you notice these steps here on the side, and picture cuts off here, but you can see the word Patrick there. Patrick County Bank was formed in 1891, and they did not build for a while. They actually operated out of the upstairs of Dr. Martin. He owned the building. He was also, I think, vice president of the bank. So they used top of his bank there for a while before they built their own. And then down below the pharmacist was the Joseph Perkins built this Hotel Perkins in 1893. No doubt the railroad influenced that. Some might be doubtful as to whether, but definitely needed a nice hotel with all the visitors that were coming in at that time by rail. In 1899, this is Judge, with the latest picture of Judge Liebrook. He died in 1899, and took 3 or 4 years for the family to settle up all of his holdings. But in 1983, Will Clark bought that 150 acres, which covered, again, this is another faint picture, but it's better than no picture. So here's the mill. There's a depot over here. But bottom line, Will Clark bought all that land pretty much up where Chestnut Avenue is today to over to 58, and started immediately selling it off into lots and divided it up, subdivided it. And one of the first lots that was bought was here on the corner of Depot Square. This was Reynolds Shepherd's storehouse, and it sat on the corner there, and then soon, over the next few years, just about all the lots were sold, whether anything was put on or not. So you see several of the buildings on what we know as Patrick Avenue today, but in that day, this was Depot Street, and it had only come into existence in the late 1890s, so it had not been there long at this time. Then across the street, all right, well, let's go back to that shop there if I can. The bank building here, the People's Bank of Patrick, was the next one up from Shepherd's building here. So across the street was First National Bank, and then beside it was Ashby's building. Interesting note, I don't know how many of you knew it. Maybe I did not. I always thought that First National Bank had built this building, but it actually was built by Citizens Bank. They built it in 1921, and a year later sold it in February to the Clarks, and Patrick County, and the name changed to First National Bank. And that was 1 month before the People's Bank of Patrick that you just saw before it was formed. So both of those banks came into existence downtown about pretty much the same time. Not a very good picture here, but this is a fertilizer house that was over the side of the mill. It also probably was built by Will Clark. I don't know that for a fact, but I would guess that it was. And here's a little bit of, you might remember the storefront here, looking behind the depot. There it is, and it's here's the Miller's house up on the hill here above it, on that lot. This is what we know as Chestnut Avenue today, looking down on downtown. You can see it's beginning to build. There's the depot, Clark Brothers here, library store here, the mill over here. There's the Miller's house. Right here is Reynolds Shepherd's store, the Riverside Hotel here, and then the McIntosh Ranger building over here, and I can't remember who, maybe a Turner had this store above Reynolds Shepherd's, but anyway, that is probably 19-teens, and the lot started leaving downtown and coming up the hill as well. Those houses, the lots that we know as Chestnut Avenue today, they started selling there in the early part of the 1900s, and Chestnut Avenue was actually developed in 1903. First house was built by Mr. Thompson, Dr. Thompson's father, Amos Thompson. In 1898, he built this part here, and then came back in 1910 and built this big, majestic part that faced Church Street at that time. And Dr. Thompson is sitting down here on this lower step down here. Now, besides the residences that were on Chestnut, it also has a cemetery. The cemetery was, it belonged to, that property belonged to John Rangeley, who also had the Rangeley store. He had buried a couple of family members over here in the center, and also Joseph Perkins, I guess, was a friend. He had allowed him to bury a child there next to his. So it was referred to as a grave site or graveyard at that time in the deed book. But 1897, Dr. Byer, the dentist, and also Malvern Stedman both went in together. They had a lot of business. They were business partners. They bought a lot of things They bought it, and I guess with the intentions of turning it into a cemetery, because they immediately started selling plots and lots for $25. So Dr. Vire took this one on this corner, and Stedman took the one that's in the fence over here on this corner. And of course, keep in mind, this is, they did that in 1897. Chestnut Avenue did not come into being until 1903, so the cemetery actually, it faced Depot Street over there, which is Patrick Avenue today. And then down below the cemetery, Stuart Normal College eventually became Stuart School, and it closed, and this became Stuart School in 1911. It was built, and that actually was referred to as the old Chestnut Orchard. That's what that piece of property was called. So I guess there was a lot of chestnut trees in there, but no doubt where Chestnut Avenue got its name. Okay, going back out to Main Street now. This, like I said, this building had come into being now in 1893. So in 1910, it became the Bank of Stuart. It had been a doctor's office. Dr. Bishop was working out of there. He sold the old building and then the Bank of Stuart built it. He couldn't put their bank in here. And again, you got Rucker's house back here in the background. Also, Amos Thompson was an attorney, and you see that little awning right there on Orchard Tree. That was his office, which is Sonny Swales today. Top of the street, 1911, where was the building still there today, is Appalachian Title. The Patrick County Bank moved out of the top of that building that was down on Main Street and built the bank building that year. And then finally, on the east side of town, those five little shops existed until 1920, and they tore those down, and the George building, as it is today, came into existence in the early 20s. So, west side of town, pretty much filled all the way down to Rock Cove Road. Still nothing over on this. This is 1923, and there's still nothing below the George building here at this time. Let's go back across the street. The Perkins Hotel Perkins had become Jeb Stewart Inn by this time. So we walk out the back door, and this is what we would have seen out the back window, at the back door of the hotel. And this was Ben May's livery stable here. And if you look on this hill over here where Stewart Elementary School is today, and blow that up, you will see, as I mentioned earlier, that is Colonel Abram Staples' house there amongst the tall trees. And then if you come down this direction, that is Joseph Perkins built that house in 1905, and I think that's owned by Ray Williams today, beside Ray's house. Come back, go down this ridge, this direction towards Carlos Mountain, towards what is today Buena Vista, and there's a couple more houses built over here. If you look in the background, that is the only industry that wasn't downtown at that time and built around the railroad. That is Stewart Manufacturing, Stewart Textile Company. There's a better picture of it. It was short-lived, only operated for a couple of years. In the early 20s, and they made wool blankets. And then Martin's Hospital downtown burned in 1925. Dr. Akers was working for Dr. Martin down there at that time, and or Dr. Martin's son. And so after it burned, he came uptown and bought the Moyer home here, which is where Horizons Bank is today, and put the first hospital, Stewart Hospital, in uptown, first hospital uptown, where I was born. And a lot of people in this room probably. My wife was as well. Back downtown again, this building here was built as a hotel in the late teens, became a wholesale food later. It's across the road from the bank, of course, right there at the bridge. Here's a different view of it over Also, during the teens, a lot of, as I said earlier, a lot of the stations went through renovations for the railroad. You would notice that there's no longer the second story that used to be there. They tore it down, and I think also they moved the passenger end down here instead of being on the other end. So that's the way the depot looked to the end. This is a railroad drawing just to show you a lot of several industries built here between the two. This was the old box factory. It became Stuart Co-op, and Robinson Brothers put a business in there, and here's the one that we just saw, the brick building. So there was a big emphasis from the railroad at this time as passenger service declined to bring businesses in, to build freight business up. That was the only way they were going to survive. So they encouraged a lot of industries to come in to along the line, and of course you saw the turntable there in that drawing. There's what the turntable looked like down what is Patrick Avenue, just not that, Commerce. Stuart Lumber Company, formed in 1921, became one of the largest manufacturers in Stuart, and still there today in some shape or form. And then here's a blueprint from the railroad, and I'll show you this just to show you some of the things along the. Here's the track over here, and here's the river, and you see these buildings in here. This was actually a chair factory, and they had about 3 different buildings along between the tracks and the creek. This was Standard Oil Company. It was formed in the early 20s by Robert Clark and I think Shockley, and they sold it to Standard Oil after 2 or 3 years. Then also, you see this red line here, another industry that came in, back the blueprint up a little bit. They ran a spur line there, took it all the way up into this open field here that's on the backside now of Narrowflex today. And Eli Thomas Lumber Company out of West Virginia built this facility back there on the backside of that lot in the mid 1930s. And then in '39, while they would remember the Stuart Mercantile building that sat there right on the side of the road, next to between the road and the river. There is a photo of it in the early days. And then back over just shot of downtown. This is early 40s. By the time the railroad left, pretty much downtown had been completed as far as all the lots and everything filled in. I remember the White House is set between the 2 streets there, and got shake hands with the person on the porch when you pass by. And if you go back uptown, of course, here's the George Building. In the late 20s, Stuart Motor Company built, and these 2 buildings here, and this one is still here today, and I think this is where the parking lot for El Rancho is today. And then it was finally, in the 30s, by 1940, the east side of town had built up all the way down, as pretty much as it is today as well. So that pretty much is the end. The end of an era, okay? Anybody got any questions about the railroad? That probably took longer than John intended on to take it. I don't know how much time it was, but it was lengthy. but I'll take a couple of questions, but I know we need to get on with other things. So, yeah.
Was John any kin to Abraham Penn? John Penn?
Yeah. Grandson, I think. I think it's grandson, but he was definitely from the Carter. I know he was. If anybody's got any questions or any want to talk about Stuart, about the railroad, about the book, question about the book, I'll be here. So, John, I'll turn the meeting back over to you, and then feel free to come up. One more question. Go ahead. Who was in the back?
Oh, it was me. Well, now that you've done the railroad book, when are you planning on taking the second half of your presentation and making it into a book? Because that would be fascinating.
It sounds like a job for the Historical Society.
Well,
With that one, I'm gonna turn it over to John.
History of Stewart. Well, I just point out, we do have maps of Stewart, I think, made in the twenties, they're fire maps.
They are 1925, that is a great resource.
You can see, I realize some of you in the back probably couldn't see that well, I thought it was gonna show up a little bigger, but we do have maps that show some of those businesses and where the railroad came in downtown and turned, we just have to look kind of close. And I just really have one little story. John D. Hooker, the judge, many of you remember, he related the story. He was in the Navy in World War II, and he was up in New York City, and we interviewed him for oral history back in the 80s. And he was up there doing some training or something, and he was out there in the harbor, and he saw one of the Danville Western engines being towed in that harbor for scrap, and he just,
He said,
he couldn't believe it.
he told me that, he said, you can imagine how I felt standing in the New York harbor, and there goes a Danville Western locomotive out across the, he told me it was locomotive number 24, which was the last one I showed you, but based on times and everything, I think it was probably number 25. 25 was scrapped about the time he would have been in the Navy, and 24 ran on to the late 40s. So I think he was mistaken about the number, but he didn't forget what he saw.
Yeah, you had one comment about, just after World War II started, that the tracks were pulled up.
Yes.
Any idea about what kind of legal satisfactions or issues that allowed that to happen?
Well, it was not welcome, I can tell you that.
Okay.
The railroad was doing, like I said, the western portion had not made money for a long time, so they had talked about it years prior of closing. So they made the decision, and when they announced that they were going to close it, the people on the western end, a lot of the businesses, they wanted to see if the railroad would keep it open long enough that they could sell it, and they agreed to it. The railroad said, yes, you go out and find a buyer and keep it open for your benefit, we're good with that. Well, as soon as they said that newly created War Production Board, they came in and they overruled, they had authority, so they just said, man, we've got it, it's ours, and that was it.
And I'm just curious about how they got the authority, by what mechanisms. Yeah.
The sign of the times, I suppose.
Yeah.
Unfortunate for people on this end.